briefly try to share that.
Sorry for that.
Okay, I could hear that. Okay, so welcome everybody. I'll try to stay on top of everything, seeing who might raise a hand and at the same time being able to present. That being said, it's a pleasure to be here again, personally for me, because not just that I'm happy to share insights into the regulatory environment and guide people to give them a bit of an orientation into the pathway. But it's also important for me to learn and to be challenged every day. And as you might know, I'm working for Siemens Healthineers. We have a very distinct portfolio. We're strong in imaging, in diagnostic imaging, and also in laboratory diagnostics. But when it comes to implants, when it comes to combination devices or certain other aspects, this is not my core business, and therefore I'm happy to get inspiring with you and also to learn from your challenges. With that being said, let's briefly delve into a topic. So today we'll give you an introduction to the medical device regulatory landscape. This is a brief orientation how to navigate through the legislative process. I hope that you guys are not disappointed if I'm using the presentation from last year, because substantially nothing has pretty much changed when it comes to the overall setup. If there's any question or if there's any clarification needed, please raise your hand or or make yourself heard when there's a suitable pause, so that we can discuss that topic while we're at it. And with that, I'd like to dive in with you into the topic. And first of all, maybe highlighting what particular aspect on regulatory affairs we're talking about here. We're talking about the discipline that has been created to access a market which is controlling products and institutions. Meaning the very moment we have regulations, the very moment we need somebody who is able in cope with them. And of course, we all know that medical devices and pharmaceuticals are a highly regulated market. Translating, if you're working in regulatory affairs, you love to read fine print. And if you love that, here's the link to our job offerings. You can apply today. I see that there's a bit of disadvantage in the presentation mode. I'll briefly stop sharing right now and be back in a second, because I always get that system here. Okay, now it should be obvious. I'm not seeing the screen, so if anybody's raising a hand, maybe moderation can take care of that. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Good. For everything that I'm usually talking, and this is the brief advantage in regulatory affairs, there's always an app for that. You can always dive back to a reference, to a standard, to a law. So whenever you're looking into what has been already done or what has been already stipulated, you don't need to believe me. You can go back and have the respective checks going and running. For some of those hyperlinks, I need to admit that there are certain conditions that have been stipulated over time, which I was not aware when I was writing the slides. So I will make you aware of that. Those restrictions include payment, unfortunately. It is not my fault. I'm just the messenger. Good. So what is regulatory affairs? Well, in essence, what I try to make an understanding is we're not the deal breakers. We're not the blockers. What we are keen in identifying hurdles and trying to make them aware. Of course, speaking out the problem requires a trusted environment in each and every company. And sometimes if that environment is not provided, you're recognized as the blocker. When it comes to regulatory, I'd like to share my insights that you need to include those nerdy people in the very beginning when you have a vision. If you have an idea that tries to solve a problem better or with less resources, you might remember those keywords from the clinical evaluation, or where you want to match stakeholder needs, you should include regulatory from the very beginning. They can help you. They can help you dealing with certain borderlines. They can help you dealing with identifying other requirements that you would probably not have been aware of when you just come from a product perspective in order to identify and solve a clinical problem. Regulatory also can help you to work towards short-term wins. That is, how to access a market is very important, whether you want to penetrate the market to very specialized folks and then immediately address your core people with a high set of value, or whether you want to start skimming the market and reaching as much customers as possible with lesser value than originally anticipated and growing over the time using the drive and also the budget you probably get from your subscribers. Yeah. So working from there on, you can go to long-term development. Yeah, involve more stakeholders, look above the rim, and especially look towards the borders which are challenged by your clinical question. So basically spoken is, okay, if you want to create an app or if you want to create a solution that provides a diagnosis, maybe you start with recommendations for diagnosis in the first place and include the physician before excluding him or her in the ultimate scenario. With that, of course, you can go step by step, increase your risk class and increase also the level of external oversight and scrutiny over time, meriting the maturity of your organization. Also here, regulatory can help you with that. Yeah? You probably don't need to change much of your technology, but you need to change a lot of your claims. And these claims have an impact towards your validation plans and your clinical evaluation. Last but not least, one broader dimension of regulatory goes in towards strategy. And this is one of the fields where I personally am very interested in when it is pretty loud. Okay. Good. So where one of the French manufacturers forged a medical device and used industry-grade silicon into human bodies, causing the implants to dissolve. And imagine what the recall would look like in those days. You don't just take an electronic product back, but you need to cut open a patient and get this thing out of here. So, of course, this is a situation nobody wants to have. And just imagine back when it is about safe use of technologies, and it has not been a very long time ago where you had X-ray machines in shoe salons. And this was quite vogue at some point in times, where people used to use X-ray machines in order to look into their shoes and see if the skeleton of the foot or the shadow of the foot fits the shoe in an appropriate way. So with that, of course, this is not safe use of technology. And with that, of course, this is one of the explanations why regulations are very important. Nevertheless, regulations cause a bubble in itself, and sometimes the regulations are here to protect themselves. I'm not saying this is by intent, but somehow it happens over time. And especially the phrasing in regulations and within one set of a document and the cross-referencing, it's not very easy to read, and it's sometimes not very easy to understand which regulations are really applicable to my product and which are not. So this is why we have regulatory affairs. Worldwide spoken, there is a common scheme about how to regulate medical devices. And fortunately, there are even interests by the regulators themselves, the Ministry of Health, the organizations, the national competent authorities, in order to stipulate common and unambiguous, but also non-conflicting requirements to the manufacturers. And it's for us as manufacturers very important to understand those requirements in order to satisfy regulators' needs. For that, there is an gremium that has been formed. It's called GHTF, and then formally went towards IMDRF. This is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. The chair this year is in Australia. And we're very happy, of course, to participate also here as a stakeholder, as part of the industry, in order to engage with the regulators and to learn from them, but also to share our ideas and strategies in our products in order to see and help them identify where we would need next regulations or clarities. And speaking of that, of course, robotics, artificial intelligence, combination products, those are all the new trend topics. And I've even heard that brain-computer interfaces are part of the MDCG's clarification, because there's apparently at least one manufacturer who wants to bring those products to the market. Well, regardless of what kind of a product, what we all need is to safeguard patient safety and public health. It's our task as manufacturers to obey to those rules. And it's the task of the regulators to protect healthcare operations, as well as the public health and the patient safety of the entire cohort they are responsible for. So with that, stability, traceability, vigilance, and all those keywords blend into the game here to support proper healthcare and also to protect anybody from not working products. By the way, and this is a very interesting observation, when it comes to software, software is undergoing a lot of regulatory changes recently. Yeah, we had cyber regulations coming up asking people, well, if you include software, think about cyber risks and threats. There's the GDPR in Europe that came up in 2016 saying, well, when it comes to the collection and processing of personal data, we might want to have a say as a consumer or as a data subject. So here we see that more and more regulations fold into the domain of software. But the very interesting part is software is still not recognized in the European as a product in its own right. I'm letting settle that for a second, yeah, because computer games are not regulated. Yeah, no, they are regulated under certain regulations, but they're not CE marked in the European Union, which means it's indicated it's not a product. Medical device software, even an app on an iPhone, can be CE marked. So here, when you look at where we are currently at CE marking and at recognition, the medical device market is at far most upfront the state of the art when it comes to software regulations compared to the other sectors, automotive, cars, aerospaces, and so on and so forth. So here we are setting the pace, and we are happily that the discussions in the new legislative framework tend to the agreement that software should be recognized in the future as a product in its own right, because it can carry its independent and particular risk. But first of all, the question lies on the table, am I regulated? Is that a regulated piece of technology that I'm having here? So first, we should start asking, is it a medical device, yes or no, in order to make the triage whether the big regulatory frameworks of medical device and in vitro diagnostics apply or not. Definitions help. And when you want to play with definitions, it's good to know them so that you can decide whether to include or to exclude your piece of technology. And here, this is the definition of a medical device as cited by the European MDR, and it is compatible with most of international legislations that have similar or identical definitions. It says medical device is something that is intended by the manufacturer to be used alone or in combination to one or more of the following specific medical purposes. By deconstructing that first sentence, we already see that software can be regulated as a medical device, that a medical device has a specific intended purpose by its manufacturer, meaning we don't create anything for fun, we create something with an intention. This intention is the intended purpose or the intended use, and we should be very careful with phrasing that intended purpose, because anything that comes to validation reflects back to this phrasing. Anything that you incorporate as technology needs to be compatible with the intended purpose. If you're not, your validation fails or your product is exceeding its definitions and your technical fight is practically worthless. Going on further, we're looking for specific medical purpose. General medical purposes are something hard to explain. Yeah, when it comes for resource management in hospitals, this is not a medical device. When it comes to process optimization in hospitals, it's borderline. When it comes to aiding in diagnosis, bam, you're in. Yeah, so you can see that multiple dimensions have multiple ways in understanding what is a medical device or not. Also, what's very important is there is one liable person. Yeah, and this is the basic concept of every regulation. You need to be able to punish somebody. You need to be able to make somebody accountable for what they're doing because, well, they're also taking the money from that. So there is always a manufacturer who needs to be identified. And regardless whether you are supplying your piece of technology to somebody else who then acts as a manufacturer or place the products on the market in your own name and right, there needs to be one manufacturer and you need to decide those. Of course, there can be multiple manufacturers, but in this case, we're talking about multiple products from a regulatory perspective. In vitro medical devices are in Europe a special kind of medical device. Not in every regulatory framework across the world do we have the distinguishing between in vitro and in vivo medical devices. So with that, Europeans made two legal framework. That's understandable from one point of view. That's challenging from an operative point of view, because in particular, if you're working in software, it can be both, and sometimes it's hard to decide which path to follow. Medical devices without the medical intended purpose can also exist. Those are the so-called Annex 16 products in the European Union. And think of beauty surgery. Or cosmetic surgery. Yeah, this is a surgical intervention. It's not for medical purpose because ugliness is a subjectual recognition and it's not a disease. So with that, if you want to cure ugliness, you need similar devices such as medical devices, but unfortunately they are not used or not intended to treat the disease. So with that, the regulators wanted to close the gap here and make sure that anything that penetrates practically the human body is recognized as a medical device, except for tattoos and piercings. That was a good lobbying. Yeah, medical device. Now, if you want to calibrate, and again, that's something I said already before, everything needs to be aligned together. Everything needs to be consistent. And if you make an exercise by writing just one document over several chapters with a team of 4 to 6 people, you immediately recognize how hard it is to stay consistent if one person writes just one chapter. Imagine that can be transposed to a technical file with dozens or hundreds of documents. And in here, you always need to be consistent. The intended use needs to be phrased. The technological characteristics need always to be folded in or under the intended use and must not exceed it. Advertisement and promotion material also is strictly regulated for medical devices and also needs to be covered under the intended use. And everything together, the way your product works, the way you advertise it, and the way you legally think it's placed on the market, this is what the Europeans call the intended purpose. So just to let you know that just writing a sentence, my product is intended for this and not for that, doesn't really help you to escape from certain regulations if you provide all the technical characteristics to be a medical device. Also, if you tweak something in advertisement, let's say I'm the best product in this class on earth, yeah, you can do that. You better have data on file to prove that. Otherwise, you should not raise that claim. And of course, as I told, there's a borderline to medical devices. And sometimes people tend to go beyond. Here are 2 hyperlinks to explain what I wanted to say here. You probably know WebMD. There's also the NetDoctor, that's the German equivalent. And basically, WebMD is convincing me I'm terminally ill since 2017, right? So whatever symptoms I insert, I'm always getting some kind of weird, rare, or horrible disease every time I use that. There's a nice disclaimer here. So WebMD tries to advertise with a good set of physicians in their board and in their development staff. But they have a disclaimer here that this does not provide medical advice. It's intended for informational purposes only. Right, but it's a symptom checker and it results with you might have this symptoms, this disease here. So here, this is a good example how technology and technological characteristics are not in line with the way that the intended use has been phrased. For this, the manufacturer decided to go with a disclaimer. I'm happy to see how this evolves over time. Also, what's very important to understand, and this is not just for medical devices, I mean, it's for any piece of technology where you have any set of requirements for any country. You need to assess this for each and every country. And making just a small example, looking at Brexit right now, is if a product is intended for the European market, it's CE marked. Great Britain choose to make a withdrawal statement and to exit the European single market and introduce the UK CA marking, which is the equivalent to the CE marking. Now, this is a great example to see, well, can we now sell CE marked products in UK? Well, right now you can, there's still a transition, but in the end, you need to affix a UK CA marking. Well, affixing a mark is easy, but the hard task is to understand what requirements are behind this mark or need to be fulfilled before you affix that, that seal or that mark on your product. So what you need to understand is that for every market, of course, there's common understanding and rules, but you need to diligently check whether the product is regulated in that market, and if yes, under which regulations it falls, and then obtain that. If you purchase a product from somebody else, the same questions apply. Yeah? Did the original manufacturer from whom I supplied this component merit the newest RoHS regulations, yes or no? If no, this product is probably not suitable for the European market, maybe for others. If it's ethical to do that, is another game. That's not regulated. But what you want to ensure is if you're procuring components or parts and materials to assemble your finished product, be sure that you talk to your supplier and ensure that it complies with all the applicable regulations for those markets where you want to sell. Making one tiny example, not about RoHS, but about Wi-Fi components. Yeah, everything is Wi-Fi nowadays, whether it's Bluetooth or whether it's Wi-Fi itself. Those products are regulated. No, you don't need a notified body in most of the cases, but you need a test certificate from and you need an EMC test pass. So you need an ISC accredited test laboratory to test your product, regardless if somebody else tested the identical model beforehand or not. You need to perform those tests. You need to obtain the verification marks. Yeah? So explaining very, very straightforward that it matters for each and every market. And this is the core discipline of regulatory affairs, to assess and to understand the mechanics of the markets and to consult the research and development activities in a company. Second rule of Fight Club is to understand those rules that they're coming. Yeah. When I started, one of the first exercises was to understand shall versus should. So here I'm passing that learning to you guys. Shall means a non-negotiable requirement. If somebody says shall, this is to be done. Yeah. Of course, you can avoid that if it's not applicable to your device. For example, if you're not, if you don't have a tangible product like a pen or something, probably biocompatibility doesn't really matter, especially for software. Yeah. But if you have something that requires biocompatibility assessment or hygienic requirements, disinfection, yeah, then this shall requirement applies. Period. It's non-negotiable. If you don't implement it, and if you don't have a trail followed in your quality management system, you don't have evidence to provide it that you made an assessment and that you implemented this requirement. The very moment you have a non-compliance. On the other hand, should is more a softer requirement. It's coming usually from standards, from guidelines. Yeah, guidelines should not use the word shall. Some do, some don't. Some don't. Yeah. So should is kind of an current state of the art. It's written by some gremia. They made up their minds and they populated this idea. So the question is, what's your excuse not to follow that? You can challenge everything, yeah, especially the should requirements, but you should have a good excuse for that. Most notified bodies tend to say, if there's a standard, you need to adhere to it or make it even better. So that's about the should. And again, to reiterate, start writing down things. Whatever you do, start writing down. I know it's complicated. I know your problems are around development and solving problems. Write everything down. Structure it in my sense later, but start writing down. If you didn't write it down, you can't show it to anybody that you made up your mind about a topic, about anything. Yeah. If you have set up your own rules to establish a quality management system, for example, and you're not following your own rules, you're not only kind of stupid, but you're also non-compliant to your own rules. Yeah. Then rework the rules or rework the way you are following the rules. If that what you wrote down is not enough to fulfill regulatory requirements, you're in violation of the law, and this is where inspections will get very dangerous. You might have heard from 483s from the FDA. Is it 486, 483, about warning letters? Yeah, this is if you're really in violation of the law, you get the warning letter, you get a second one, and then it starts escalating. So my recommendation to everybody is to establish, to document, implement, and live a quality management system and follow your procedures. Though slim it might be, just do it. If you don't have it, you're in big trouble. If you have it, then at least you can defend yourself and can say, well, made up your mind. If my supervising or body or notified body thinks this is not sufficient, I have a position to correct. If I don't have anything, I have no position to defend. So I talked earlier about that the regulatory requirements apply for each and every market distinctively. And the question is now, well, is there some sort of common consensus? Can we build on common ground rules and can we apply them to all the markets? Well, there's a yes and no. On the one hand, standards. Standards are great. Yeah, standards are a consensus state of the art on a very, very technical level. They can be for technology, they can be for quality management systems, they can be for procedures or for welding or anything. For anything can standards exist. And if they are standards, you should consider them, you should follow them. Otherwise, either you lack of compatibility or you lack just of common of things how people expect you to do things. So that's one aspect. The very good advantage of standard is they form a sort of consensus among the industry and among other stakeholders. And I truly recommend, and I do promote international standards here. Not because I say DIN is not important. No, that's not true. But regional standards are very difficult to comprehend on the one hand side, because most of the times they're written in the regional language. So when it comes, for example, to Chinese standards, it's very hard to translate them. The translation gets ambiguous. So the words safety and security are often mixed up. And with that, international standards would, of course, be very, very helpful. On the other side, regional standards can also contradict international standards. So manufacturers would then make a choice. Well, do I ignore that standard? Is it mandatory? Or do I create a product specific for that region in order to overcome that barrier and merit that standard and thus build the trust in my potential customers? So you can't just reiterate, think about standards. The way how laws interact with standards is a very interesting mechanic. So you might want to read a law and then ask yourself, well, how is now a particular standard, let's say ISO 13485 or 62304, come into play here? How is the mechanic ongoing? In the European Union, this is done via harmonization. In the FDA term, we talk about recognized consensus standards. How does the system work? It means that somebody based their mandate on a certain EU regulation, which is currently under revision or at least under analysis, takes the legislation and takes the standard and compares them bit by bit. At the end, an Annex Z is expected to follow from a European level. This Annex Z tells how the standard clauses satisfy the requirements in the legislation. There may be partial requirements. They may cover only partial of those requirements. They may cover more requirements. But in the end, this translation table is very, very important. It can tell you which of the general safety and performance requirements from Annex 1 can be satisfied with one particular standard and in which ones you need more. So having that Annex Z is very, very important. The problem is this so-called harmonization is very, very impeded in the European Union because the definitions and terms always need to be identical. Otherwise, somebody, especially from the legal perspective, will challenge the validity of the standards to the legislation because they're speaking of different terminology. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So with that, the harmonization is a very difficult task. And unfortunately, we don't have much harmonized standards under the new European regulations. And looking at my watch, I think it has been almost 5 years since they have been on the market and published back in 2017. So I'm not saying it's a shame, but we should speed up. Now, I've talked already about general safety and performance requirements. Here to navigate you into Annex 1 of the Medical Device Regulation, probably most of the interesting annexes that you can see. Annex 1 should be understood as a checklist. Yeah? Think of it as every clause should be one checkpoint you need to follow, maybe even deconstruct into the individual sentences or parts of the sentences if you need that. What you can then do is to associate to each of those requirements either an applicable standard, a procedure in your quality management system which refers or bases on a standard, and then ultimately the technical documentation where you have the evidence that you satisfy the requirements set out in Annex 1. Annex 1 can be understood as 3 different major parts. We have general requirements, requirements regarding design and manufacture, and also requirements regarding the information supplied with the device. So think of leaflets, IFUs. And Article 5 says about placing on the market and putting into service that a medical device may only be placed on the market if it's and maintained. Need to start over. A device may be placed on the market and put into service only if it complies with the regulation, when duly supplied and properly installed, maintained, and used in accordance with its intended purpose. That means if somebody uses a surgical pen, which is intended to be delivered in a sterile way, and which is intended to mark incisions where physicians would then cut open and do surgery, yeah, those pens can also be used for doing a groceries list. Yeah, nobody will claim that a pen that was intended for chirurgic incisions will also be suitable for groceries or for anything else that would be not according the intended purpose. So you see, you can limit your evidence always to that what you wanted to do with the product. You need to foresee and look at foreseeable misuse, but totally abuse or off-label use, that is not covered by the regulations, and this is something you can easily withdraw and say, well, this is not what the product was intended for, and did everything as a manufacturer to prevent that use, but the operator somehow overrode all those safety safeguards. A device shall further meet the general safety and performance requirements set out in Annex 1. So that's a shall requirement, which means this is non-negotiable. The only part is you can check each and every bullet and can state, this is not applicable to my product. But then you need an explanation following why you think this is not applicable, and then write it down in that checklist. Demonstration of the conformity with the GSPRs shall also include a clinical evaluation according to Article 61. Good. So next to checking the validation, next to checking the technological characteristics, you also need to provide proof points that your product is safe in clinical use and can also reach its clinical purpose and its clinical advantage. And whether it's to protect wounds from getting dirty and infected by using a plaster, or whether it's a computer tomography machine by being used to create images that are suitable for diagnostic reading, where you can detect lung nodules, cancers, or I don't know, whatever, fractures, yeah? You need to be able to demonstrate that in real life. That means you need a clinical partner in most cases. Devices that are manufactured and used with health institutions shall be considered as having put into service, meaning If I am liaising as a technology provider with a hospital, and if that hospital uses my medical devices, they fall under this regulation. The very moment the hospital sells those devices or puts them somewhere else in use, let's say at another location, it's considered to be placed on the market. At that time, CE marking is compulsory. Specific requirements in Annex 1 tend to look for specific characteristics and technologies. Now, this is a very, very interesting nuance because usually legislation tends to look at a very, very high level. Here we have a set of regulations that looks one level deeper, saying the MDR says you need to look on chemicals, you need to look on substances, and refers to RoHS and REACH. You need to look on infection and microbial contaminations, and of course, test that. For infection, for example, there was a case reported in the US about cross-infections from using endoscopes because they had flexible optic arms, and those flexible arms, they were intersecting in their leaflets, meaning that contamination could be stored and not reached through normal decontamination and cleaning procedures. This caused cross-contamination. So with that, in the design, you need to make sure that infection and microbial contamination are addressed, as well as if you incorporate materials of biological origin, if you interact with your environment, or even with IT, if you emit radiation, have a measuring function, whether you're an active device, whether you're an implantable device, and so on and so forth. Whether those sets of requirements apply to your product or not is of course based on the structure and technological characteristics of your product and by foremost the intended purpose. Meaning if you don't want to ionize, don't want to emit ionizing radiation, you better don't have an ionizing radiation button because otherwise somebody would say, well, it's intended to emit ionizing radiation. So the intentional radiation would not be applicable. The unintentional radiation, you should have a look at. What I'm also telling my peers is learn from failure of others. And this is where I need to raise my disclaimer now. Unfortunately, BfArM has decided to put the paywall in front of their information because the law says you can choose whether to make this available for free or not. So BfArM said, we're low on budget, we're putting up a paywall. The intention of those databases are to be available to public, so that research can identify with what kind of classes or kind of technologies we have recalls and where we do have significant risks to public health when using those products and where do not. So using those databases from an industry and manufacturer point of view should be folded into the risk management procedures, of course, and should be regularly checked. In Europe, this is a shell requirement. On the other hand, you can learn from others by looking for the product that you want to create and whether such a similar or maybe identical product is already on the market. What you can do is you can use the pre-market database to see what in the 510K in the US, what has been filed as specific characteristics to the product. And then you can compare to the post-market library and see what problems they had. Maybe this is not applicable to you, maybe it is, and then you can learn by not doing the failures which were done by others. The same happens for the BfArM site, and I would honestly be very happy to share with you insights into the new EUDAMED database from the European Union, but unfortunately it is not live yet. Yeah? We do have a playground, we do have a voluntary use of actor registration and device registration, but publicly available pre- and post-market data in such a way that the US FDA provides is unfortunately not possible as at this moment in time with the EUDAMED. Think of 2023 to go for a start, not earlier. That's databases. Now let's look into the concept of clinical validity. Well, clinical validity starts with the question, what do you want to advertise? How do you want to position your product on the market? Advertisement, of course, is regulated, surprise, under the MDR in Article 7. And it basically wants you to prevent from advertisements like this: smoke a fresh cigarette. Yeah? It's your choice of the physician, or Sugar's Quick Energy, to eat less, glow with health with X-rays or something else from the Virex Electric Company. I personally like those very much. But honestly spoken, yeah, smoking a cigarette from Camel probably doesn't give my throat a vacation. It probably will kill me. So with that, Article 7 clearly says that, and this is very important to understand, that anything that may mislead the user or patient is prohibited. Which means then, in essence, if you're looking at your user group, you should determine whether those are professional users or lay users. If those users are lay users, you probably need to find the stupid persons on earth and test your product. If they do it right, you did it right. If they're doing it wrong, you should work on your user engineering and on your claims. So whenever you do advertisement, whenever you do instructions for use, whenever you do anything, use the stupid person from your user group in order to validate that. May is a very dangerous word because it is a personal conception. And the lawmakers left that open to merit the development of time. Something can mislead today, and the identical situation might not mislead in the future because it's clear. Or otherwise, it remains ultimately European Court of Justice decision on what is misleading and what is not. Definitely, you should not ascribe anything you do not have. Yeah. So don't advertise features which you do not have. Don't advertise products which you do not have. Yeah. At least not without a disclaimer. And don't create a false impression about the product. So thinking about artificial intelligence, don't create an impression that your product is able to diagnose any treatment when it's requiring a professional use in order to aid him into diagnosing anything. Also, check your points. Failure to inform is considered as misleading. Suggesting users that are off-label are considered misleading. Just to make one big example, there was a medical device company in the past, and this was run through the press, so this is a very exciting example, which was selling lithotripter. It's a technology that uses sound waves in order to destroy kidney stones and have them flushed out through the natural process. Those lithotripter have been sold to orthopedics. You might ask, what does an orthopedic use with a lithotripter? He doesn't usually deal with kidneys. Well, they were using this for rheumatic arthritis for patients and use the shock waves for the joints in the hand and on the body. So that could be considered as suggesting a use that is not really covered by the intended use, probably has not been validated by this company. But it has been sold to that. And the very moment the health insurance companies got wind of that and asked themselves, why does a orthopedic use lithotripsy whilst this is not cleared at any reimbursement scale? They start to raise questions. And fortunately, that practice was repealed. It was pretty much a decade or so ago, but it gives you a very, very good understanding about what is considered suggesting a use and what not. And you should rather not sell your product to anybody where you're really sure that they are going to abuse it. So how do you understand and how do you triage your claims into evidence material? Like I said, everything needs to be put to file. If it's not on file, if it's not written, there is no evidence. Henceforth, there is no evidence to compliance, and you get the finding. You don't want to have findings. So first of all, you should make up your marketing claims. Marketing can be sometimes very creative, or it's their job. So what regulatory affairs needs to do is to calibrate them to the reality, or at least use an unambiguous wording in order to better clarify. Like I say, don't mislead. And it happens in the biggest companies that marketing gets sometimes very creative. We do have a review process for that. So in essence, we start with a claimed clinical benefit. So we say, okay, this is something that alleviates, cures, diagnoses, helps anything. Yeah. So let's triage that for a bit example. Is that what it's doing? Is that a positive impact of the health of an individual in terms of patient-relevant clinical outcomes? Yeah, which is then bordering to reimbursement, or whether it's expressed in terms of diagnosis, yeah, faster, better, whatever. If it's that, then it's a clinical claim. In that case, you should follow MDR Article 253, that's the definition, and then work from there on to include that claim into your clinical evaluation, scan the literature, find the material, and then decide whether it's sufficient or whether you want or need to go for clinical trials. Another aspect is the positive impact on patient management and public health, both contained in the MDR and in the IVDR. And here on patient management, things get difficult. Yeah, for patient management, it could be beds, special beds. Yeah, for patient management, could also be management software like RIS or hospital information systems. Here, you touch the borderline of being regulated, and it clearly shows you that even with a claim, I can make my product a regulated device. Even though the technological characteristics and the intended purpose, the intended use might not fall that, but let's look back to the triangle, to the three circles. If I raise a claim, it can make it a medical device. If I also have a positive impact of a device related to its function, it's a typo, such as screening, monitoring, diagnosis, or aid in diagnosis, this is coming from the IVDR, interesting. But it nevertheless gives you a good understanding that also those claims are clinical claims. All other claims that are not falling under those criteria are technical claims. Why it is important to understand? Clinical claims are subject to the clinical evaluation. This is a long-term, costly, and exhaustive process. Technical claims can be done by bench testing. It's cheaper. So having a good delimitation between clinical and technical claims is always good, and having that in your procedures is probably not the worst thing that you could do. Making one of those examples, if I have a pen, let's stick with a pen, and if I use that, and if I say this is a pen, I bought it from, I don't know, Kmart or whatever, and I'm using that pen now and sell it and advertise it as this is a pen where you can mark your incisions for surgeries. That's a claim. And at the very second, it's a clinical claim. So you make your product a medical device. Hold on for a second. Okay, we're school holidays. Let's continue. Creating clinical evidence means clinical data and the results from the clinical evaluation pertaining to a device or similar devices, and including that in your technical file and into your quality management systems. Basically, it means that you need to ensure that you have sufficient evidence at file to state that your product is safe for use and that it's meeting its clinical characteristics. And those can be clinical investigations on your device or on similar devices. You can use PubMed or Embase to search for similar devices. Scientific reports, post-market surveillance data, and in specific, the post-market clinical follow-up are everything that is generated as clinical evidence. So the question, of course, is what is an equivalent device? Because that's one of the most important factors. How do I do my assessment when I assess my clinical data about the equivalence? And unfortunately, the screws have been tightened on European manufacturers or manufacturers who want to go for the European market, because we have a triumvirate. We have 3 criteria to check. It needs to be technically equivalent, which means the device needs to be of similar design, similar conditions of use, similar specifications and properties, and so on and so forth. Meaning, you need to know a lot of your equivalent device before stating that you're equivalent on a technical level. Practically spoken, some notified bodies believe that you need access to the technical file or to any standard that has been applied to the device in order to see and make a good determination that those technical equivalents exist or not. This is a very big hurdle. Clinical equivalence, the device is used for the same clinical conditions or purpose, including severity, stage of disease. This is a bit easier to understand because you can easily scan the market and see what do users use today in your field. And it comes also with your pitch. So what do you want to solve? What do you want to remediate? So the clinical equivalence is probably easier to get. Biological equivalence, if the devices uses the same materials or substances that are in contact with human body, of course, you can use that biological equivalence. If not, you have to create data. What does that mean? Think about how the FDA does it. You do a 510K and you note down all the relevant characteristics that are really pertinent to your device. And then you compare it with all the products that you find that are somehow similar. And you make up a matrix, and then you get an understanding of where is the highest level of similarity, where's the lower level of similarity. And maybe this even changes from technical, clinical to biological equivalence. So you need to use a matrix understanding and not just a one-to-one comparison. Based on that, you get an understanding what you need to do when it comes to literature research, usage of material, and then at which points you have gaps and you need to perform evaluations or studies in order to overcome those gaps. This is an evaluation starts and then an investigation comes after. So the question is, if I know the market access conditions for one market, is everything is going to be the same for all the products? Yeah. For EU market access, Article 10 is one of the very, very good starting points to look at. So when navigating through the medical device regulation, I told you Article 7 is for advertisement. Annex 1 is a good checklist for general safety and performance requirements. Harmonization of standards is done in the official journal, unfortunately, and then Article 10 tells you what you need to observe as a manufacturer. By the way, if you're selling your product to anybody else, Article 16 holds a convenient checklist how to not get or how somebody else can become a manufacturer. So here you go. Manufacturers ensure compliance with applicable regulations, which means you need to identify those first. They need to establish, document, and implement a risk management system, which means an understanding cycle to how to identify and how to treat risks. You need to conduct a clinical evaluation, keep your documentation up to date, perform a conformity assessment pertinent to your device. That's Article 52, which tells you for which risk class and which type of device you need to do which conformity assessment procedure. So it's kind of a flow. You need to assign and register a unique device identification. This is the first point where you need external. Yeah, so you need to contract GS1, for example, and purchase a UDI or set of UDIs. You need to keep your technical documentation 10 years after the last device has been covered onto the market. For us in Siemens Healthineers, our retention periods align international matters. In Canada, it's 25 years. Have fun building up a good IT system or a hand system that satisfies 10 or 25 years and is still readable and compatible. You need to cover responsibilities from your peers throughout the entire supply chain. You need to maintain production in conformity with the requirements and, of course, establish a quality management system that encompasses corrective and preventive actions and post-market surveillance. So basically what you need to do is to describe everything that has been shown here on the left side in your management system. You have a good way to store and retrieve data on a long-term basis. I've mentioned that already. You need to provide scientific proof that the device is clinically effective and stay on top of that and document everything again. So this is why things get more expensive over time, because there are regulations and because there are those rules. Now on OEM business. It's a vital aspect, and unfortunately, the MDR has set some kind of hurdles in it. Some say it's impossible anymore if you don't have access to the technical documentation. Others say with good contractual work, this might have happened. Here we are at the point where we have Article 10, Section 15. Manufacturers have their devices designed or manufactured by another legal entity. That information shall be submitted, which means the very moment you write your name on a product and identify yourself as a manufacturer, use your schemes and everything else, the very moment you become the legal manufacturer, regardless of whom that they did the production. So what you need to do as a manufacturer is to write the declaration of conformity, draw up the technical documentation, and perform the post-market activities. But just as you do the relabeling doesn't mean you know anything about the product. It could just be a marketing gag. So this is why we say private label manufacturers and OEMs need to work very close together. One example has been shared a couple of years ago in one of the social networks, where a Canadian brewery gave away complimentary condoms. We know condoms are medical devices that are intended to control conception, as well as to prevent sexually transmitted diseases. They're of class 2B. This is the highest medium that I can get. In the US, they're class 2 with special controls. However, the Canadian brewery was close on the border. They purchased that from a US supplier. Well, they had the FDA stamp and everything on it, so everything was cool on the US American side. But since there was an import into Canada, Health Canada came into play. Unfortunately, neither the manufacturer has intended Canada as a market, nor had the brewery seen that. So in essence, this was an OEM business, cross-border, and they got caught. They needed to stop distributing those condoms, and they needed to go back to the original labeler. So that was just a nice example about something as trivial as a parisser, in order to understand where the hurdles of the OEM business are, because the brewery in that case was acting as a manufacturer in an OEM situation, and by that they had no documentation, no registration, nothing. If you do that, you need to establish a good contract. There's something broken. Sorry. I will fix that before distributing the slides. I'm sorry. So the question now, based on the EU system, is there's something called an external supervision. This is the notified body in our case. In the UK, it's the UK approved body. Well, if there's any, there are 3 currently only. And the level of external oversight is reflected by the risk class or what you're doing with the product. Notified bodies are a private entity. They're commercial. Yeah. They get money from us as manufacturers in order to punish us, which is a very interesting understanding about how business relationship works. But they are designated by a national competent authority. So they have a very, very high mandate, and they live this mandate, of course. They can visit manufacturers announced and also unannounced. And if they have reason to believe you're doing things wrong, they probably will not show up just one time. Usually they take samples of devices. When it comes to big equipment, probably it's not going to be the sample way, but the access to the device way. They will look into the technical documentation. They will check it for consistency. They will look into the post-market surveillance data as well. Manufacturers can apply for a notified body and involve them into the conformity assessment procedure. And if you do so, this notified body number needs to be affixed with a device. Now, if you turn your phone around, there's probably no notified body number on it, because the red directive doesn't require that a notified body is involved. But if you turn over your one of your bigger electrical equipments, probably there is a notified body number next to the CE mark. Also, if you do shopping next time, you can have a look at that. This is where you can get external oversight. Here we go. Okay, so the classification is an abstraction on a risk basis, which means the lower the class, the lower the risk associated with the use, or the lower the risk if somebody goes wrong with a device. The lower the risk class, also, the lower is the regulatory oversight, meaning probably nobody would care. What's very important for you as a manufacturer is to understand in which drawer to put your product, in which drawer to put your socket. So whether you're class 1, 2A, 2B, or 3. And in case your product satisfies multiple of those definitions, you take the highest one, or you create multiple products. That's up to you. Now, the conformity assessment pathways in a simplified way is a very, very is a very, very important understanding. And I stole that graphic a bit from Emergo. Here's the reference to the original graphic. It means that coming from the classification assessment, you make it, you will find a decision how to access the market. Different annexes in the MDR will tell you then which possibilities you have and which preconditions you need to fulfill in order to place the product on the market. The level of external oversight and scrutiny, of course, increases to the right when you go for risk class 3. In risk class 1, except if it's for reprocessing, sterile, or measuring instrument, there is no CE mark with a notified body. Only if you follow those 3 exceptions, then you are in the class 1 and you need the notified body. Class 2A, of course, needs a notified body, and there are different ways to go that, either with an assessment of the full quality management system and the technical documentation without expert review, or by just looking at the technical documentation. The more assessment you have beforehand, the more flexibility you will get in making independent decisions. Meaning if you go through Annex 2 and 3, your notified body will only look at this product. If you want to bring out the next version of a product, which is maybe significantly changed, you will need to do that again. If you go with a full quality management system, the notified body not just assessed only your product, but also the way how you deal with everything else surrounding it and give you much more freedom in order to make a choice what is significant and what is not, and put those products on the market. They will review afterwards and see if you did everything right. So you have, on a business perspective, more flexibility, but of course also with a higher invest. For Class B, of course, there's no possibility to go without the quality management system. Audit, assessment, yeah. Of course, for everything you need a quality management system, but here this quality management system is assessed. And for Class 3, we're going up to type examinations, which means you cannot do any change without informing a notified body. Now, when it comes to software, things get a bit complicated. The Rule 11 has been introduced into the medical device regulation because it was recognized that software has an indirect risk. It supplies information, and depending on whom takes that information, a stupid person or not, or if that information is of a higher significance or not, a different risk can occur. The Rule 11 says you can have all 4 risk classes, 3, 2A, 2B, and Class 1. But practically was designed intentionally by certain member states and by notified bodies in such a way that it would up-classify certain software, that is to raise their risk class when you look from MDD to MDR. Why is that? It's a political deal. Yeah, there's no logic behind that, only with a short populistic statement saying, I'm sorry, but we feel that there is so much uncontrolled apps in the app stores where they advertise with a CE marking or not without any clinical check or validity, and we want to increase that in order to safeguard users. One might challenge that statement, but in a political process, sometimes feelings overrun science. So unfortunately, we need to deal with those Rule 11. And fortunately, we have an MDCG guideline how to deal with that rule. So it's not a nightmare, but it's good to understand how the rule works. So the application of Rule 11 is transposed to it, is kind of reflected to a document that was originally coming from IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. Under the lead of the US American FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, a few documents just for the purpose of software were created. Those documents had 2 vectors of assessment that result in a risk categorization. Those vectors are, on the horizontal side, the significance of information. Does the software just inform? Does it aid in treatment or even treat or diagnose itself? And the situation in which the patient is in. Now, when I am coming here from a very, very generic software, let's take a PACS as an example. Picture archiving and communication software. It's taking every bit and piece that is kind of an image from medical devices and it's storing it. It's usually coming with the software to evaluate those images, not to put on measures. Now, if I say a measure is 3 centimeters, that can mean anything. A diameter of an adult aorta is 3 centimeters is okay, I guess. A diameter of a cyst in a newborn's child brain is probably not okay. But since the 3 centimeters are only a support in the diagnosis, and at the same time we do not know in which situation the patient is in, we are agnostic to that, we need to take the highest route. This is the backdraw of the Rule 11, and this is the effect of what's coming from the political motivations. So a PAX, which was in class 2A in the past, is a class 2B today. Effect pre-market, 0 to less. Effect post-market, higher sampling rates. Yeah, so it's a bit more costly. So when we tend to coming from software and looking towards artificial intelligence, what I did not include on purpose here is the Artificial Intelligence Act at the very moment. It's a highly political discussion that is currently going on here, and I'm very, very sad to see how things are going. So let me just reflect a bit where we have stable ground to stand on. Artificial intelligence should be understood as a very specific technology set for software. Period. It's just one kind of software. It's maybe a different way in creating software, but in the end, it's an electronic formula which processes kinds of information and puts it to order. So with that, artificial intelligence is nothing else than software. It's taking data, it's processing data, and it's putting data out. And this set of instruction has also been part of several European guidances. One of them is referenced below. That's the MEDDEV 216 from 2016. Sorry. It's been a long time. That document is no longer applicable under the MDR. It has been transposed to MDCG 2019-11 under the MDR. So this is the first point that I'm making. Artificial intelligence should be understood as a special piece of software. And then, of course, all the software requirements apply. Challenges, of course, remain, because we should not simplify and say artificial intelligence is automatically evolving itself over time without any controls. That is not true. Artificial intelligence is a scientific field and can include much technological characteristics. The most prominent one is machine learning, maybe even deep learning here, but machine learning is kind of the most prominent one where we already reached a kind of state of the art. So what we do have as a concept in all legislations across the world is the concept of change. Whether you change the patient population, your brand, the labeling, that is instruction for use and labels, the performance characteristics or safety characteristics, you constitute a significant change. A significant change is something where regulators say this is no longer the same product. After a significant change, we are talking about a new product, which means it needs to undergo a new conformity assessment and build up all the evidence independent from the preceding product. If we would have an algorithm in a medical device that would change itself without any boundaries or controls, it would likely to happen a significant change. With that, we would have dependencies to UDI, we would have dependencies to UDAMED and to listing, we would have dependencies to importer, because they need to affix their credentials to the device in the UDAMED database. We have a lot of dependencies which remain currently unanswered. Also, clinical users might be overwhelmed with the fact that a product can behave differently at a different point in time. When we talk about certain aspects like repeatability, reliability, performance, or explainability, interpretability, repeatability, reliability, and performance are included in the medical device regulation. We need to be able to demonstrate that when a software is getting the same input data, it produces the same output data. This is repeatability. Reliability is something that has not been forged into standards. Nobody can tell you for sure what does reliability mean. Is it the availability of a product? Is it its uptime? Is it that it accurately works? Well, on an accuracy perspective, I would say every product needs to accurately work. So when we talk again about a product that can change itself over time without the manufacturer control, we probably have a lot of obstacles to overcome. My recommendation is here, don't do that. This is creating a mass confusion right now, and honestly, lacks of trust towards the technology. Don't do that. Freeze your products. Let them learn over time, but not apply the learned ones over time, but use the telemetric data to gain insights into what your users are doing and how your product is behaving and how you can improve it even further. And then there is the interesting discussion with the Draft AI Act. Article 43, Section 3 or 5 says, I'm still not so firm in this one, says that, and it's using FDA terminology in a European document, that if there is a predetermined change plan, any change of the product that it's doing by itself under the conditions of the plan is not a substantial change. Now, the word substantial comes from FDA. It needs to be understood as significant change in European terms. But what would that imply? It would say that products which are under the AI Act and medical device software at the same time would not be considered a significant change if the change has been predetermined, which means if you have set up a plan how your product should evolve over time, maybe to even specialize to a certain cohort in a certain region. Yeah, that can happen. It's an interesting idea. It's also a legal challenge. Can one legislation immediately affect one other's understanding about a significant change, about the very, very specific definition of an article? These are the questions which we again raise to Commission and ask for clarity. Now, the Draft AI Act has medical devices in their scope. So once it is out and the discussion is final, we need to analyze it and we need to implement it with every dependency that is coming. But as of now, the text is in a so high flux that I'm very reluctant to include it in this presentation here. In most AIs, we also talk about autonomy. And even some definitions of artificial intelligence include the term autonomy, including the ones from the European Union, where the software or the artificial intelligence can take autonomous decisions. Well, if you put autonomy, that concept of autonomy into medical device regulations, it doesn't make any sense at all. Why is that? Because your product needs to be able to fulfill its intended use. If it fulfills its intended use, then it is completely autonomous within that intended use at the degree that is intended by the manufacturer. So what is autonomy? Is it going beyond the intended use? Well, if the product is doing something beyond the intended use, we've learned this is not compatible with MDR, you should not do that. So if we flex in autonomy, we probably should reflect back to what IMDRF was saying. The significance of information can be a model how to measure the degree of autonomy by saying how much does the product take away the human in the loop, that is how much the product can replace a professional or a lay user in making a decision or a treatment. With that, we can make an understanding about the level of autonomy, but we should not go beyond that, because then we would go beyond our intended purpose of a product and then saying, well, autonomous to what? Yeah, we always need a calibration. So I would highly recommend, and I'm always recommending lawmakers to abstain the concept of autonomy in medical devices. If we look for a second away from the European market and going to China, Singapore, and Korea, they already have been stipulating guidance papers for medical devices containing artificial intelligence. China goes in such a way that they're saying, well, machine learning is kind of the old way of doing AI. We're doing the new way of AI. It's deep learning and everything black boxed, which is interesting to follow and difficult to understand at the same time. Others go in such an idea that they say, okay, good. Let's just reflect back for a second. Well, you have an algorithm that is intended to do something. You need to assess your algorithm, of course, and can certify that. But let's roll back and ask, how did the algorithm come to such the position that it does work? Yeah? You probably need to process data. You need to train it. For this, you need labeled data or annotated data. Yeah? For this, you need data. And for this, you need somehow a place where data is created. This is a very, very interesting concept, and it's very logical from a quality management perspective. However, it has not been stipulated in regulations as of now. But still, there is a possibility that's saying, okay, if we select only Caucasian males from our medical images in order to be analyzed, our algorithm would probably be biased towards Caucasian males and would discriminate Afro-Americans females. Yeah. Well, if we reflect back and say, well, but it's scanning a disease that is predominant in Caucasian males and is non-existing in females, prostate cancer would be such an example. Good prostate cancer can also occur in African American populations. So maybe we need to find another example, but let's stick for a second. Yeah, then it would be non-discriminatory. Otherwise, you need to phrase a lot of explanations. And by spending just 3 sentences on the matter, it gives you an impression how important it is to make a good choice about the data you're using for training. Well, then the next question is, well, do you have any requirements to the data quality? Does it need a special signal-to-noise ratio? Does it need a special protocol how it's being acquired, a special set of technology, invasive, not invasive, blood pressure measuring? Yeah, how accurate and how sensitive does it need to be? This is where you would have requirements to data acquisition. If you have them, write them down. If you don't have them, tell people by I have no requirements to that. And also be sure to have a wild user test with any kinds of data. Now, the data transfer, how do you obtain the data? Yeah, do the GDPR things like removing personal information as far as applicable, and do the annotating. What is the required annotation expertise to your team? Who's doing that? Especially in terms of federated learning, where you leave the hospital to do that annotation. But do they always do it in the right way? How can you monitor them? That's a quality management perspective you need to have a look at. And then, of course, you fold back. So that's a cycle. I have lots and lots of slides going into details here, but this is just giving you an overview of how people on an international level think how AI should be regulated in medical devices. And this is a compilation of different understandings, mostly Chinese-driven as well as Korean, in order to come to that picture. So you see regulatory science is going on, and it's fascinating to follow here, especially from an advocacy perspective. Now, I said in the very beginning, you can use regulations also to tweak your business model or to determine where you have a significant advantage in a certain market and where you have not. We've learned that in the European Union, the stringency of regulations was increased over time with the introduction of the medical device regulation. Now here I want to show you that with the 21st Century Cures Act and the US FDA, the opposite thing happened. In order to promote breakthrough devices, recognize standards, and deregulation of low-risk devices, guidelines have been forged, and software that was in the 70s the highest risk class, a simple decision tree, is now no longer regulated or is falling under so-called enforcement discretion. That means the FDA still says you need to follow the rules, but they're not checking it at every stage. However, if you get caught, you better be prepared to be following the rules. Or translating, it's 30 in my street. We won't be doing speed tests, but don't be sure on that. So in order to support the uptake of newer technologies in the healthcare market, the last thing that Obama did to the healthcare sector was the 21st Century Cures Act. And we were so lucky that Trump didn't repeal that one too. So it was pretty much giving a good pathway to industry for low and medium risk devices, especially looking on software and digital health technologies. Now, if you compare that to European levels where the risk class has been flipped upwards and you need a notified body, you might want to elaborate if you want to penetrate the US American market first, gain clinical data there, write a good rationale why you want to use that clinical data for European population for the clinical validation, not for reimbursement, that's probably impossible, and then use that data for the European market. I'm not advertising that Europeans should be second, I'm just saying this is how you can use regulations for your business. That's for the sake of completeness, the details on the digital health program. And I'm a bit mindful of the time now and not going into detail here. Bordering to medical device regulations, especially on the regulatory clearance of CE marking, is of course the reimbursement of and coverage. That's called the fourth hurdle, and it takes reimbursement, especially in Germany, is a very interesting field. However, recent news showed that we are stopping the digital prescription program, meaning if you want to have an app prescribed, you will still use paper. That's Germans, yeah. So manufacturers, in addition to CE marking, need to demonstrate a whole lot of other things. So compatibility, interoperability, IT security, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, clinical validation only is the starting point. Yeah, you need to provide socioeconomic benefit demonstration, and this is going beyond CE marking. When you have technical requirements, you should consider them at the very beginning, also for the initial CE mark device. With that, you can go for a preliminary reimbursement route in Germany and work towards the clinical validation and socioeconomic benefit. If you don't do that beforehand, you need to stop your submission. You need to fix your product first and then apply for a second reimbursement scale at the same time. What is very sad is that Germany was one of the drivers to upclassify medical device software, and at the same time introduced only for 1 and 2A risk classes the reimbursement scheme as a low risk setup in Germany. This is not understandable at all if you don't know how the BMG works, and it has been different departments. That's all. Yeah. So we hope, of course, that this law sustains the future as well and evolves over time to include 2B and ultimately Class 3 software as well for reimbursement, because this is where the real benefits are. So coming again, yeah, we started with a vision. We addressed our markets, either European or US based. We developed a strategy and encompassed also reimbursement topics at a glance to be able to understand what regulations are intended for and how to deal with them. I find regulatory affairs by far one of the most exciting fields in medical devices and in the medical device industry, and I don't stop learning every day. With that, thank you so much for paying your attention for this long time, and I'm happy to see and get into challenge with every one of you in the Ask Me Anything sessions.
Yes, thank you, Tobias. I would say that this was the best way how to present something that's naturally not so interesting in a like super interesting way. So I was seeing smiley faces all the time, basically. Yes, regarding the following steps, tomorrow and after tomorrow we have Ask Me Anything sessions. So basically there will be me and Tobias, and Tobias will answer your questions, what you will have to deal with regarding regulation. If some questions are not answered, or you need some additional sessions, so we have few individual session slots again in the general mentoring file, as the same as Ask Me Anything sessions. And some of you asked that, yeah, you didn't saw the information regarding Ask Me Anything sessions. Yes, you can still register for those ones, and I will just send you an invite, so no problem. And of course, yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tobias, for the perfect presentation.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions right now?
Yes. What
okay.
I heard best, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, yeah,
no,
I always
no,
have
your
questions.
question will be better, that's for sure.
Okay, no, but you cannot. Oh yeah, well, I was wondering, Tobias, when you're talking about like the data acquisition aspect, the life cycle for data acquisition, if there's some similarities with good clinical practice for medical devices, in the sense that because most data for medical devices is acquired normally is going to a clinical study, all those things that you're mentioning, even the oversight of the healthcare provider, the clinical partner, is already covered there to a certain extent. I understand that maybe there's not formally the connection, but do you see it as being more or less the same steps, or there are gaps or other things that we need to pay attention to?
Well, being a radiographer by training myself, I know that you have differences in how an radiographic image, for example, or how a clinical information is obtained, because patients behave differently. I'm not always in the same mood, and sometimes I need to switch to another material, another device, because my main device is blocked by an emergency situation, so that I'm not accessible to the most recent technology. My recommendation would be here to look at to note down at least the properties that are very important for you when using the material, and to define including and excluding criteria, where you say, well, this is something, the angle is not perfect, the shade of the knee is not perfect, yeah, the tibula, the prodominantia are not overlapping perfectly, so this is not suitable as an image to be annotated. Or if you're looking at the voice recognition, it's nice to meet you guys again. That if there's too much noise, too much background noise, yeah, if somebody used the device in an airport, yeah, then it might not be suitable to use that data. Maybe it's more suitable to use the device in an escaped or in a shielded environment. It's kind of those considerations I would recommend to use and to perform inclusion-exclusion criteria. Of course, then you have requirements in the creation. You need to be able to understand if the creator does tag your information in such a way. So when you create images, for example, the code of the medical device is usually incorporated in the image metadata. It's easy to come from there. For other information, I'm not quite sure whether such high standards exist today. It's been a mess in the hospital information systems world, the ECGs and everything else. Usually it's PDF or some else of encapsulation around it. So sometimes it can get difficult.
Basically, my question were regarding outsourcing manufacturing. If we're talking about device plus AI or IT, then of course it's quite popular to outsource some manufacturing steps. Do we have some risks or something that we should be aware regarding healthcare regulation when we do so?
When you're doing outsourcing something, but in the end you act as legal manufacturer, I mean, you take all the risks. You're responsible for everything. Responsible doesn't necessarily mean that you do the things, but if you have somebody else doing it, you need to be able to have this under control as at an equivalent level as if you would do it on your own. And everybody does outsourcing, yeah? Whether you want to, on short term, increase laboratory capacities to create COVID-19 tests, whether you want to use a specialized IT department that does machine learning and deliver those models back into other departments who build the scanners, yeah? Everybody does outsourcing. Even in our company, we do cross-sourcing, yeah? But it's very, very important to understand that the person who places the product onto the market is ultimately liable. And you need to be able to stand in to your outsourced peers as if they were your own. And coming from there, everything you task to them needs to be clearly understood. The mechanisms of work need to be clearly understood. And also the limitations and boundaries need to be clearly understood. In essence, you need to give them a set of instructions and a set of requirements. And you will probably receive a deliverable back and a set of documentation, including definition, technical assessment, and risks that have been analyzed and assessed in the deliverable, as well as residual risk, which cannot be solved by the component, but need to be solved from the outbound, that is with you. So that is the bare minimum that I would ask for.
Okay, super, thank you. So do we have any last questions? Or we are ready for tomorrow and after tomorrow? I guess, yes, we have to think of what we just heard. So yeah, I would say that it will take some time. So yes, see you soon, guys, basically for tomorrow. Okay, thank you.
All right, looking forward. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.